When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled out of the factory, few believed this massive, overweight machine would ever become a symbol of American air dominance. Compared to the sleek European fighters of its time, it looked clumsy and unrefined, a flying barrel. Even among American pilots, skepticism was widespread. They joked that if it ever lost its engine, it would dig its own grave into the ground. Yet behind that bulky frame lay a masterpiece of engineering philosophy, one that prioritized endurance, firepower, and raw power over elegance. The idea was simple but revolutionary. American engineers wanted an aircraft that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, survive punishing damage, and still deliver devastating counterattacks. They weren't trying to build a racer. They were trying to build a tank that could fly. In 1941, while much of Europe was burning under Luftwaffe dominance, the design team at Republic Aviation took a risk that would forever change the skies. They designed the P-47 around a single engine so massive that it dominated the entire aircraft, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a beast producing over 2,000 horsepower. At first glance, it seemed excessive, but in war, excess often becomes advantage. The P-47's thick armor, oversized frame, and immense engine allowed it to dive faster than almost anything in the sky. It was not a dancer, it was a hammer. What the Germans didn't understand was that the Americans were playing a different game entirely. Not finesse, but overwhelming force. When the first prototypes entered testing, pilots were stunned. It was heavier than any single-engine fighter before it, yet handled smoothly at high speed. The massive turbo supercharger gave it unmatched performance at altitude. For the first time, Allied bombers could have a guardian angel capable of keeping pace with them, all the way to the heart of Germany. The age of fragile dogfighters was ending. A new kind of warbird was about to take the stage, one that would not just fight the Luftwaffe, but outlast it. The P-47's first combat deployment in 1943 was met with laughter from German pilots. They called it the flying milk bottle, mocking its size and bulk. Against the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, the Thunderbolt looked like an easy target. Early missions didn't help its reputation. The aircraft's short range limited its ability to escort bombers deep into Germany, forcing it to turn back long before the raids reached their most dangerous points. But as tactics evolved, so did the Thunderbolt's legend. Allied engineers quickly modified the aircraft with drop tanks, extending its range. Pilots began to understand its strengths. It could dive faster than any German plane, absorb damage that would destroy most fighters, and still bring its pilot home. Slowly, confidence replaced doubt. A German ace once remarked, "We shoot at them, and they just keep flying." That resilience became its signature. Reports began circulating of Thunderbolts returning to base with half their tail sections missing, holes the size of basketballs in their wings, and oil pouring from ruptured engines, yet still landing safely. What the Germans dismissed as brute engineering turned out to be a survival miracle. As the P-47 units grew in experience, they realized something else. They didn't need to turn with German fighters. They only needed to dive, fire, and climb away. With superior firepower and dive speed, they could choose the terms of every fight. The Thunderbolt had entered the battlefield not as a gentleman duelist, but as a brawler that refused to fall. At the heart of the Thunderbolt's dominance was its extraordinary engine, the R2800. It was the most advanced piston engine of its era, driving a massive four-blade propeller and capable of generating nearly 2,500 horsepower in combat settings. To manage its power, Republic engineers installed a complex turbo supercharging system that kept performance consistent even at high altitudes, something most Axis fighters couldn't match. This made the P-47 unique. While German aircraft gasped for air above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt thrived. Its pilots could chase enemy bombers or fighters to the very limits of the atmosphere. The cockpit was also a pilot's dream. Roomy, well-ventilated, and equipped with one of the best visibility canopies of the war. Every control was designed for clarity and reliability. But the P-47 wasn't just about speed or altitude. It was built to endure punishment. Its airframe could withstand extreme stress. Engineers tested it by overloading its wings far beyond standard limits, and it survived. Even its landing gear, oversized and sturdy, allowed it to operate from rough frontline airstrips. The P-47 embodied America's wartime industrial philosophy: build it strong, build it fast, and build it in massive numbers. By late 1943, production lines across the United States were rolling out Thunderbolts faster than Germany could replace its losses. It wasn't just a fighter, it was an industrial statement. The P-47 carried 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, each capable of firing over 800 rounds per minute. It was an unprecedented level of firepower for a single-engine fighter. While German planes often carried 20mm or 30mm cannons, they had fewer of them and far less ammunition. The Thunderbolt's guns created what pilots called a curtain of fire. In combat, that meant a Thunderbolt could unleash nearly 100 rounds in a single second, shredding enemy aircraft before they could react. Pilots learned that a short burst was enough to disintegrate even the toughest targets. Its ammunition belts were filled with a deadly mix of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, each designed to ignite metal and fuel. Ground attack missions proved equally devastating. The P-47 could carry bombs, rockets, and fuel tanks, transforming it into a flying fortress. It strafed trains, convoys, and enemy columns with ruthless efficiency. German soldiers soon learned that the deep growl of the Thunderbolt's engine was often the last sound they would ever hear. By mid-1944, the P-47 was no longer a defensive escort. It was an offensive weapon of total destruction. From Normandy to the Rhine, it blazed a trail of devastation, dominating the skies and the ground alike. As the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, the Luftwaffe began to crumble under relentless air attacks. The Thunderbolt squadrons played a decisive role. They hunted enemy aircraft, destroyed fuel depots, and ripped apart supply lines. Every mission reduced Germany's ability to fight. German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt now feared it. They knew that even if they got behind one, shooting it down was far from easy. Its thick armor could absorb punishment that would obliterate other fighters. One Luftwaffe veteran later admitted, "When a P-47 was behind you, you had seconds to live." Its reputation spread fast, not just for its destructive power, but for the courage it inspired among Allied pilots. They knew their machine could bring them home, no matter what. Confidence in the P-47 became a psychological weapon. The Luftwaffe's morale collapsed under the weight of American steel and determination. By late 1944, the skies that once belonged to the Germans now thundered with the roar of Pratt & Whitney engines. The war had changed, and the P-47 had become its hammer. Early in the war, Thunderbolts were primarily used as bomber escorts. But as new fighters like the P-51 Mustang took over long-range duties, the P-47 found a new purpose: ground attack. It became the backbone of tactical air power. Flying low and fast, Thunderbolts rained fire on trains, tanks, and convoys. Pilots described the sensation as flying through hellfire, dodging anti-aircraft guns while unleashing devastation. Yet few other aircraft could survive such punishment. Many returned riddled with holes, their pilots alive only because of the armor plating that surrounded them. Its adaptability made it legendary. Whether escorting bombers at 30,000 feet or blasting railways at treetop level, the P-47 delivered. The same brute engineering that once seemed excessive had proven prophetic. In every environment it excelled: hot, cold, high, or low. By the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe had turned into a symbol of complete Allied dominance. What had once been the proud hunting ground of the Luftwaffe was now ruled by the relentless roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The German pilots who had mocked it 2 years earlier now spoke its name with dread. For them, survival had become an act of luck rather than skill. Fuel shortages had crippled the Luftwaffe's operations. Even the most advanced aircraft remained grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Airfields lay shattered under constant bombardment. Maintenance crews worked under the ruins, cannibalizing wrecked planes for spare parts that would never be enough. Yet the Allies continued to fill the skies with wave after wave of new machines, each gleaming Thunderbolt a fresh reminder of American industrial might. Feldwebel Klaus Brechtender, one of the final Luftwaffe pilots trained in 1945, described his only combat mission in haunting words. They came from above, 4 P-47s in perfect formation, like falcons descending on helpless prey. I tried to turn, but it was useless. They fired before I could react. My aircraft felt as if struck by hammers. The engine exploded. The wing tore away, and in seconds I was falling through flames. His account mirrored countless others. German pilots were outnumbered, outgunned, and utterly outmatched. The psychological impact was devastating. Medical officers began recording cases of what they called Jagdjagd fever, fighter-bomber fever. Even experienced pilots who had once faced British Spitfires and Soviet Yaks without fear began showing symptoms of severe stress and panic attacks at the mere mention of Thunderbolts in the area. The distinctive sound of their engines, the deep mechanical thunder that gave the aircraft its name, was enough to make men freeze. Ground troops learned that when that sound approached, their only chance of survival was to throw themselves into ditches and pray. Day after day, the Thunderbolts patrolled every altitude. At low levels, they strafed columns of trucks, trains, and armored vehicles with deadly precision. At medium altitudes, they loitered above the battlefield, waiting for any sign of movement. And high above, others kept watch, ensuring that no German aircraft could approach without being torn apart in seconds. There was no longer any sanctuary, neither in the clouds nor on the ground. The statistics from this final phase of the war were staggering. P-47 squadrons claimed the destruction of over 3,700 German aircraft in aerial combat, 3,300 on the ground, 9,000 locomotives, and 86,000 railway cars. They obliterated convoys, bridges, and supply depots, leaving the once powerful Wehrmacht paralyzed. German logistics, already strained, completely collapsed under the relentless pressure. The Thunderbolt had become not just a fighter. It was an industrial weapon designed to erase the enemy's ability to fight. By this stage, the Luftwaffe was little more than a name. Many of its most experienced aces, men who had dominated the skies in 1940, were dead, captured, or flying outdated aircraft that could barely climb above 20,000 feet. Young recruits, some barely 18 years old, were rushed into combat with fewer than 30 hours of flight experience. In contrast, American pilots entered battle with over 400 hours of training, perfect coordination, and the advantage of overwhelming numbers. Captured German pilots later confessed that by 1945, most missions were suicide runs. They were sent aloft knowing that Thunderbolts waited at every altitude. Many deliberately flew at treetop level, hoping to avoid radar and visual detection. But even then, the P-47's massive radial engine could dive from the clouds and catch them in moments. The 8 synchronized 50 caliber Browning guns didn't just destroy airplanes. They shredded them into clouds of metal fragments and fire. At interrogation centers after the war, German intelligence files revealed the complete reversal in the Luftwaffe's assessment of the Thunderbolt. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter. Minimal threat. December 1943. Significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. Each line told the story of a transformation, not only of an aircraft, but of an entire philosophy of warfare. The Americans had built a fighter that didn't rely on elegance or agility, but on sheer power, durability, and industrial precision. The Thunderbolt could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft and still return home. By April, even German commanders admitted defeat in the air. Major Werner Haase, a veteran of 200 missions, summarized it bluntly. "We lost not because they flew better, but because they could afford to lose." He wasn't wrong. For every Thunderbolt lost, 2 more rolled off the assembly line. For every German pilot killed, the Americans trained 10 more replacements. The balance of power was irreversible. And so, as the Reich crumbled and Berlin burned, the Thunderbolts continued their patrols, thundering over cities reduced to ash, ensuring that no remnants of German air power could interfere with the final Allied push. For the Luftwaffe, the war in the air had ended long before the guns on the ground fell silent. The sky belonged to the Thunderbolt, and with it, to America. When the guns of Europe finally began to fall silent in the spring of 1945, one aircraft stood as the undisputed symbol of American air supremacy, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. What had started as a heavy, awkward-looking machine, often ridiculed by its own pilots, had become the hammer of Allied victory. The Germans who had once mocked it now spoke its name in whispers, as if mentioning death itself. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's former fighter commander, would later say in an interview, "We underestimated it completely. We thought the Americans built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were wrong. They built a weapon of war designed to outlast us." By 1945, that truth was painfully clear. The Thunderbolt had become the physical embodiment of American industrial philosophy, a weapon built not for beauty, but for endurance, power, and simplicity of mass production. Every bolt, cable, and plate in its frame carried the mark of a nation that understood the realities of total war. The aircraft's rugged design philosophy was unique. Its wings could support more than 40,000 pounds, 3 times its own weight. The engine mount was tested to withstand forces exceeding 12 Gs. Its control cables were doubled, providing automatic redundancy if one snapped in combat. The ammunition system was electrically boosted, ensuring that even during violent maneuvers the guns would never jam. Pilots could trust their weapons with absolute certainty, a rare luxury in air combat. For the men who flew it, that reliability meant life itself. Lieutenant Frank Red Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group recalled, "I took flak through the wing, engine hit, coolant gone, half my instruments dead. But that Thunderbolt just kept flying. I crossed the channel with the oil pressure at 0 and landed in England smoking like a chimney. No other plane in the world could have brought me home." Even the Luftwaffe's engineers after the war admitted that the P-47's durability defied conventional design logic. Where German aircraft relied on lightweight construction for agility, the Thunderbolt used brute strength. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, a 2,000 horsepower monster, gave it both speed and survivability. The big radial could take hits that would have shredded liquid-cooled German engines, yet still keep running. Its 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, delivered 13 rounds every second. Each bullet carried a mix of armor-piercing and incendiary loads that ignited fuel tanks, tore through engines, and turned enemy fighters into flaming wrecks. The weapon system was brutally simple, easy to maintain, and utterly reliable. The convergence could be adjusted between 150 and 400 yards, allowing pilots to calibrate their kill zones with precision. The American 50 caliber rounds were masterpieces of engineering in themselves. Their armor-piercing incendiary design included a delayed fuse, ensuring penetration before detonation. Once inside, the incendiary core burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum and ignite fuel vapor. German 20mm shells, though larger, often exploded on contact, creating spectacular flashes but less structural damage. The Thunderbolt's guns didn't make a show. They ended fights. In 1944, as the Allied invasion of France began, the P-47 became more than just an escort fighter. It was now a tactical weapon of destruction. Flying in formations of hundreds, Thunderbolts roamed behind enemy lines, hunting locomotives, trucks, and tanks. Every day, they struck bridges, roads, and rail yards, choking German supply chains. Wehrmacht convoys moved only at night, terrified of the daylight sky. The German infantry had a name for them, Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. Whenever the distinctive roar echoed across the countryside, soldiers abandoned vehicles and scattered for cover. Entire battalions halted movement for hours, simply because one flight of Thunderbolts had been sighted overhead. The terror wasn't imagined. Reports compiled after the war revealed the staggering destruction caused by the P-47s. More than 120,000 tons of bombs dropped, 135 million rounds of ammunition fired, and 60,000 rockets launched. Each Thunderbolt could unleash the equivalent firepower of an artillery battery in a single pass. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Thunderbolt story wasn't its combat record. It was how effortlessly America produced it. By the end of the war, 15,683 P-47s had rolled off assembly lines. At peak output, Republic Aviation completed one every 57 minutes. Across the ocean, the German aircraft industry was collapsing under shortages and bombings, while American factories ran day and night, their lights never dimming. Workers, many of them women, built these complex machines with incredible precision. They followed blueprints the size of banquet tables, assembling thousands of parts that fit perfectly, because American industry had standardized every nut and rivet. Each aircraft carried not just metal, but the collective power of an entire nation mobilized for war. The Luftwaffe could never compete with that. They built fighters with craftsmanship. The Americans built them with machines. It was not a difference of quality, but of philosophy. Germany designed art. America designed victory. As one German officer later put it, they didn't win the air war through genius. They won it through production. They had enough steel, enough fuel, and enough men to keep sending them. We ran out of all three. And yet, even this explanation misses a deeper truth. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a product of industry. It was a triumph of engineering imagination. It proved that in modern warfare, survival mattered more than elegance, firepower more than finesse, and reliability more than perfection. The sound of its guns, that rhythmic mechanical thunder, became the soundtrack of Allied domination. Soldiers on the ground called it Roosevelt's piano. Each burst was like a chord of victory, echoing through the valleys of Europe and the jungles of the Pacific. By the time Germany surrendered, even its own veterans spoke of the P-47 with reluctant respect. The plane they had once laughed at had become their executioner. As one Luftwaffe pilot confessed in 1945, "When you hear that sound, you know death has come calling. We stopped fighting. We started surviving." The Thunderbolt had not just defeated the Luftwaffe, it had erased it, systematically, ruthlessly, and irreversibly. When the war ended, Europe lay in ruins. Its cities bombed into silence, its skies finally clear of the smoke and fire that had once defined them. But above the wreckage, in the memories of soldiers and pilots alike, one sound lingered: the deep, relentless roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt. To the Allies, it had become a guardian. To the Germans, a symbol of unstoppable doom. The war was over, but the legend of the Thunderbolt was only beginning. In the shattered airfields of Germany, captured Luftwaffe officers were brought to inspect the Allied aircraft that had dominated them. Many had never seen a Thunderbolt up close. They stood before it, silent, hands clasped behind their backs, studying the thick armor, the massive engine, the sheer size of the machine. Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's surviving aces, later said in an Allied debriefing, "We thought it was a joke when we first saw pictures of it. Too big, too heavy. But now, seeing it here, I understand. It's not a fighter. It's a flying fortress with wings." That fortress-like design had rewritten the rules of air combat. Unlike the elegant, knife-edged German fighters, the Thunderbolt fought with brute physics. It dove faster, hit harder, and survived longer. In a vertical dive, it could reach speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than any German piston-engine aircraft could safely handle. Pilots called it riding the lightning, a descent so fast that the plane's frame groaned like a living beast. During those dives, German pilots often broke off pursuit, afraid their wings would shear away. The Thunderbolt, however, stayed intact. Its wings, reinforced with a thick spar, could handle the stress. And its control system was built with automatic trim adjustments to prevent catastrophic loss of control. It was more than a plane. It was evolution in motion. And it wasn't just feared in the air. On the ground, it became the executioner of the German war machine. Thunderbolt pilots perfected the art of low-altitude attack, strafing trains, destroying convoys, even cutting telephone lines with their propellers. They operated like aerial predators, turning every daylight movement into a risk. A German railway officer wrote in his diary in 1944, "We repair one track in the morning. They destroy it by noon. We send fuel in trucks at night. They find it by dawn. There is no safe road, no safe hour." The Allied command understood what that meant. Control of the air had evolved into control of the battlefield itself. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe could no longer function effectively. The P-47s flew with near impunity, sweeping aside what few German fighters dared to challenge them. One of the last major dogfights took place over the Rhine in March 1945. A squadron of Thunderbolts engaged a group of desperate FW-190s. Within minutes, 4 were shot down. 2 collided while trying to evade. Not a single Thunderbolt was lost. When the smoke cleared, the German pilots were gone, and the sky belonged to the Americans. After the war, Allied investigators examined the Luftwaffe's combat reports. They were shocked by how often German pilots had underestimated the Thunderbolt. Many believed they were fighting the lighter, more agile P-51 Mustang, unaware that the massive fighter they faced could outdive and outgun them with ease. The confusion often cost them their lives. But the Thunderbolt's victory was not just in the numbers. It was in what it represented. It was proof that the industrial power of a free nation could overwhelm even the most technologically advanced enemy. Every rivet, every bullet, every gallon of fuel was part of a grand equation that Germany could no longer solve. In 1946, during the Nuremberg interviews, a former German armaments officer made a chilling admission. The Luftwaffe, once feared across continents, crumbled not with a dramatic final battle but with exhaustion. Its pilots were gone, its fuel was gone, and its morale was gone. By the last months of 1945, most German airfields were graveyards, blackened wrecks of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs lying beneath the silent gaze of Thunderbolts circling above. American pilots walked through those airfields, inspecting what had once been their greatest enemy. Some felt pride, others only sorrow. Lieutenant William O'Brien, who flew 72 missions in Europe, later wrote in his diary, "They were men like us. They fought bravely, but they had no chance. We owned the sky and they knew it." The P-47 story didn't end there. When the war moved to the Pacific, the Thunderbolt continued to serve with distinction, escorting bombers over Burma, the Philippines, and eventually striking targets deep in Japanese territory. Its heavy frame allowed it to carry more bombs than some light bombers, earning it a new nickname among American ground troops, the Juggernaut. Even Japanese pilots, known for their fierce fighting spirit, feared it. The Zero was agile, but fragile. A single burst from a Thunderbolt's guns could tear it apart. The balance of power in the air had permanently shifted. Technology and firepower had replaced agility and grace. By 1945, the age of the lightweight dogfighter was over. The world had entered the era of machines like the Thunderbolt, fast, armored, and deadly efficient. In post-war years, many nations sought to acquire the aircraft for their own defense. France, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, and even China flew Thunderbolts. It became a global symbol of resilience, a relic of a time when raw strength had saved civilization from collapse. Today, only a few dozen remain airworthy. But when one takes flight, its roar still carries the echo of that brutal age, the sound of freedom forged in fire. As historians often say, the Spitfire was beautiful, the Mustang was elegant, but the Thunderbolt was immortal. And in the quiet airfields of America, where veterans sometimes gather to see it fly once more, there's always a moment of silence when the engine starts. Because for them, that sound is more than history. It's the voice of survival, the thunder that ended fear. When peace finally returned to the world, silence settled over the airfields where once the roar of engines had never ceased. The great machines that had carried nations through fire were now grounded, their propellers still, their pilots home. Yet among all those warbirds, one name continued to echo louder than the rest: the P-47 Thunderbolt. For years after the war, its legend only grew. Mechanics spoke of its indestructibility, pilots remembered its strength with reverence. Even the enemy, those who had faced its guns, admitted respect for the American monster that had changed the very nature of aerial warfare. In post-war Europe, the Thunderbolt was more than a weapon. It was a symbol. In France, children would watch as U.S. pilots conducted demonstration flights, their aircraft glinting in the sunlight, each pass a reminder that freedom had returned. In Germany, the same aircraft that had once brought destruction now flew in peace, carrying mail, supplies, and occasionally even medical aid to the same cities they had bombed. Irony had never flown so high. But history has a way of remembering not just machines, but the men who flew them. The pilots of the Thunderbolt were a special breed. Young, confident, often no older than 20. They entered the war with fear in their eyes and left it with steel in their souls. Many never came home, but those who did became living testaments to courage and endurance. In a 1947 reunion at a U.S. airbase in England, a former Thunderbolt pilot named Major Robert Hawk Davis said, "When you sat inside that cockpit, you weren't just a man anymore. You were a part of something indestructible. You could feel the engine through your bones. It made you believe that nothing could stop you. And for a while, nothing did. That belief, that sense of invincibility, was not arrogance. It was the quiet confidence born from surviving what few ever could." After the war, the P-47 was gradually replaced by newer, faster jet aircraft. Yet for a decade after victory, it continued to serve around the world, in the air forces of France, Italy, Mexico, Brazil, and others. In some places, it became the first true fighter jet substitute before jets themselves became reliable. Pilots from developing nations called it the Iron Eagle. Mechanics called it the Last Warrior. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, the heart of the beast, became a legend in itself. Even decades later, engineers studying its design found themselves awed by the sheer simplicity hidden beneath its complexity. It was not built to impress. It was built to survive. In one of the most famous post-war demonstrations, a P-47D Thunderbolt was flown non-stop across the United States with minimal maintenance. It completed the journey flawlessly, proving that wartime engineering had achieved something beyond its time. The aircraft became an icon of American industrial might, not sleek like the Mustang, nor graceful like the Spitfire, but unbreakable, unstoppable, and unforgettable. Across the Atlantic, in the ruins of what was once the Luftwaffe's empire, German engineers began to study the Thunderbolt closely. They were fascinated not by its beauty, but by its philosophy. The idea that reliability and endurance could win wars as effectively as speed and maneuverability. Some of those lessons later found their way into the designs of post-war jets in Europe. The irony was unmistakable. The same machine that had destroyed their air force had now inspired their next generation of aircraft. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Thunderbolt lay not in technology, but in psychology. It changed how nations thought about warfare. No longer would air combat be about elegance and style. It was now about power, durability, and precision. The Thunderbolt had proven that overwhelming strength, when guided by skilled hands and relentless production, could become an unstoppable force. In the 1950s, as jet fighters took over, the last of the Thunderbolts were retired from active combat service. Some were scrapped, others sold to foreign allies, and a few found their way into museums. Yet each surviving aircraft carried with it the spirit of the men who flew them, a living monument to a time when the world was on fire, and a handful of pilots carried hope on their wings. One such aircraft, a P-47D named Big Joe, now rests in the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. Its olive green fuselage still bears the scars of war, bullet holes patched with aluminum, faded nose art of a smiling cartoon pilot, and a tally of missions flown painted beneath the cockpit. Visitors pass by reading the placard that lists its specifications, unaware that the metal before them once roared across the skies of Normandy and the Ardennes. Beside that aircraft stands a small plaque engraved with words from General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. If I were to name the aircraft that did the most to win the war, I would have to say the Thunderbolt. It gave us control of the skies and the freedom to fight on the ground. Even decades later, surviving pilots still spoke of the P-47 with a mixture of affection and awe. In interviews conducted during the 1980s, many said they would have chosen no other aircraft. One veteran summed it up best. The Mustang might have been prettier, but when the sky turned black with flak and fire, every man wished he was in a jug. That jug, as it was affectionately called, became a symbol of resilience, not only for America, but for all who fought alongside it. It reminded the world that true strength comes not from perfection, but from persistence. As the Cold War dawned, the Thunderbolt quietly faded from the world stage, replaced by jets like the Sabre and the Phantom. Yet its thunder never truly disappeared. Every time a new generation of aircraft rolled off the assembly lines, heavier, faster, more advanced, they carried a bit of the Thunderbolt's DNA in their design. It had set a standard: to build for survival, to engineer for endurance, and to never underestimate the power of determination. Today, when a restored Thunderbolt takes to the air at an airshow, people still stop to look up. They cover their ears as the massive engine roars to life, shaking the ground with its familiar growl. For a moment it feels as if time itself has rewound, as if the skies of Europe are once again filled with the sound of freedom. Old pilots, now in their 90s, sometimes shed quiet tears watching it fly. For them, it's not just an airplane. It's a memory of youth, of courage, of friends who never returned. One veteran once whispered while watching a Thunderbolt take off, "They say the thunder dies when the storm ends, but this thunder, it never ended." And perhaps he was right, because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just built to win a war, it was built to define an era of grit, sacrifice, and unshakable faith in the power of ordinary men to do extraordinary things. In the chronicles of history, it remains not just an aircraft but a symbol of strength, of endurance, and of a world that learned, through fire and thunder, how to be free again.